Invites insights from Professor Janine O'Flynn, co-editor of the book, and Dr. Usman Chohan, chapter contributor on how positive public administration can offer valuable lessons for Pakistan. The discussion will center on how the positive public administration principles are powerful and valuable and how they can inspire reforms and foster effective governance. Strategies for fostering resilience, innovation, and public trust in Pakistan will be explored with the aim of bolstering public institutions through positivity. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now introduce our esteemed speakers of the day. Can we please have the slides, the speaker bio slide shared, please? Thank you. Our first esteemed speaker of the day is Professor Janine O'Flynn. Professor Janine O'Flynn is the director of the Australian National University Prof School of Public Policy, the leading public policy school in the region. She's an expert in public administration and management, having advised governments around the world on issues ranging from the design of effective performance management systems through to collaborative approaches to policy design and implementation. She's also a fellow of the U.S. National Academy of Public Administration and the Institute of Public Administration Australia, and she also sits on several advisory boards. Professor Janine is an award-winning researcher and educator and is committed to better understanding how government works and contributing to improving the outcomes of those activities. Ladies and gentlemen, our second esteemed speaker of the day is Dr. Usman Chohan. Dr. Usman Chohan is an international economist and academic currently serving as advisor to the president of CASS on economic affairs and national development. He's recognized as one of the top 100 authors on the Social Science Research Network, the world's largest open repository of knowledge out of over 1.2 million authors. In the past 6 years, he has authored or edited 8 books published by Routledge. Dr. Chohan holds a PhD in economics from the University of New South Wales, Australia, where his research pioneered a multidisciplinary synthesis of independent legislative fiscal institutions, and an MBA from McGill University with additional coursework at MIT Tsinghua. His professional background includes roles at the National Bank of Canada and the World Bank. I'd now like to invite Dr. Usman to share some brief opening thoughts with us before we move on to the presentations from both the speakers. Please, sir.
Thank you, Zara. I'm just going to quickly share my screen with everybody. So the subject of today is positive public administration, lessons for Pakistan, and we're building on a massive tome that was published. Janine O'Flynn, Professor Janine O'Flynn, who is with us, was one of the editors of that, and I had the honor of being a chapter contributor to it. So in introductory remarks, I would just like to mention in brief praise of Janine. So Janine is a very, very prominent voice in the field of public administration, and she is particularly a prominent voice in public value in addition to that. And I have drawn extensively on her work in my research, in my book. She is often cited because of various important pieces she has written, articles she has contributed to the literature, particularly the one mentioned here, Making Sense of Public Value. In fact, and I think I mentioned this to you, Janine, I had hoped that Professor Janine O'Flynn would have been one of the examiners for my PhD back in the day. But you don't get to choose, so unfortunately not. But I guess it's a good thing because then Janine wouldn't have to fail me. So we can all be friends because of that. Now, the book in particular, in my judgment, after reading the whole thing, not just my work to it, I find it to be path-breaking in this discourse of positive public administration, which Janine will explain what this is, how this came about in the last 2 decades. It is very comprehensive because there's many authors in this from at many levels of seniority from all around the world, very diverse bunch, including men, women, etc. All the diversity slices you may cut. It's very comprehensive in that sense. And I believe now that this will be a very long-lasting text in this. So whenever people think public administration and positive public administration, they will come to this book. And therefore, I think it's very influential. So I would like to hear Janine's thoughts in a more elaborate way, and I invite all of us to. listen to that. So over to you, Janine. Janine, you'll have to unmute.
Let me share my screen. Sorry, I was doing too many things at once. This is an occupational hazard, isn't it? I think we can see them and you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation to join today, and particularly to Dr. Chohan for his very, very generous introduction, and also to Zara for her introduction as well. I'm really happy to have accepted the invitation here today, but I'm also very happy that Dr. Chohan accepted the invitation to be in the book. I was very keen for him to be involved in this collection, and I'll talk through today why I think it's important that we have the greatest diversity of authors and expertise in that. As we set out today for this conversation, I want to spend a few moments, if it's okay, just introducing myself. You gave me an extremely generous introduction, but I thought I might just take a minute to talk people through a little bit of my own development to understand how I ended up here. It's quite an unusual topic, and I think as I talk through some of the rationale for why we wanted to do this book and this larger project, there's a lot of people that have been involved that in the past have looked at things like scandals and how government doesn't work. And so to get a group of people to start on this, the first stage of this project, which I'll talk about in a moment, to start even talking about positivity was in itself a fairly radical act. And so it's been a really interesting journey, intellectual journey, I think, for a lot of us. So I am a scholar of public management. I trained, as I was chatting about as we were starting, in economics. Half of my study was in economics, and the other half of what I studied was really organizational theory. And so I come to issues of public management with that background. I have spent a lot of time over the last couple of decades, I'm sorry to say it ages me quite a bit, looking at issues around public sector reform, looking at how governments change or don't in different parts of the world. And I'm particularly interested in these questions of why we have such bold aspirations for change, but why we never necessarily meet those aspirations in practice. And so I spent a lot of time looking at this sort of aspiration achievement gap is how I like to describe that work now. I've worked on topics like large-scale reform projects that sought to infuse public sector systems with competition and new contracting models. I've worked here in Australia with our Central Public Service Commission over several years to develop performance management approaches that try to build high-performance government. I've explored big themes of collaboration and joined-up government and how to design what I call relational architecture to get the business of government done. In this area of public value where we share a lot of intellectual similarity, I first wrote about that almost 20 years ago, and I thought I'd never write about it again. About every decade, I write a piece on public value, and it always serves me well. People read that work, but it's been a really delightful area to see some of the developments in that field, particularly Dr. Chohan's work, which is bringing such a fascinating perspective to the ideas of public value, and it's really delightful for me to share the screen with him today. In recent years, I've been moving on from questions about how we do things. I spent a lot of time in probably the first 15 years of my career really fascinated by how do we design the right mechanisms to get the business of government done. In the last few years, I've been focusing a little bit more on questions of right and wrong. This is a dangerous place for public management scholars to go, but really some of the broader moral questions about the instruments that governments use. And that's another book that I'm working on at the moment, and I have been working on for some years. Earlier this year, I had a book published with another set of colleagues that explored how the COVID pandemic had impacted the public management field, both conceptually and practically. And of course, I've been working on what I would describe as possibly my most favorite ever research project with a big group of colleagues from around the world. And it's my favorite project for reasons I'll talk about later. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of the map of my mind and the areas that I've looked at over the last few decades. But it also helps, I think, to understand my commitment and connection to public sector practice. I work a lot. I'm here in the capital of Australia. We have literally from my window, I can see the Parliament building. We have very good connections in with practitioners of public service. And I think, like many of the other people who were on the original manifesto piece around this, I have really a deep commitment to thinking about government, but also how we can improve it. And this is what helped a lot of us to take this, what I might refer to as a positive turn, to think about not only what didn't work in the public service and what perhaps needed to be fixed, but also thinking about what does work. And this is what inspired really the project that we've done. So in opening up the book, one of the things that we were really very committed to thinking about was to dedicate this to those who continue to believe in and work towards good government wherever they are in the world. We had a very international group of authors, but this was really a driving force for the editors, but it also helped to shape the project, which was, could we develop some ideas that would be helpful, not just some academic exercise, but would be actually practically helpful for our colleagues in practice. And many of the people involved in the project have a very deep commitment to improving that practice. So how did we actually get here? A few years ago, there was an email trail started going around between the group of scholars that are listed on this first image that I have here, which was saying it's time to start looking at what works in government in a new way. There has been a lot of work across the world that considers this question of sort of what works, particularly from the United Kingdom. But we thought that there was a potential in the field to start looking very specifically at this idea of positivity. And so Scott Douglas and Paul Ter Hart, who are at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, started this idea. And we wrote what was referred to as the original manifesto in 2020. It came off of a much larger project which had been started at Utrecht in the Netherlands, which was looking at the question of policy success. When that team was doing the project, they obviously spent a lot of time looking at public administration, but they were looking at successful policy around the world and how could we explain that. And so they decided that they'd take a next step and start convening a group of people who were interested in public administration. Ironically, given some of the names that are on there, and many of them are very prominent people in the field of public administration management, we had a lot of trouble getting this article published. And so one of my colleagues sent out a very frustrated message on Twitter, as it was still known then, around how he couldn't get this thing published. And all of a sudden, editors started contacting us to see if we'd like to publish it in their journal. That's not a strategy for publishing, I tell people, but it was what happened in that. So this was really the invitation, as the article says, to walk on the bright side of public service and to spend some of our efforts and attention really looking at positive aspects of public administration. And it follows on from traditions in other fields which have taken a positive turn as well. Positive psychology being the most famous perhaps, but a whole range of others which look at sort of positive aspects in their own disciplines as well. The book project came after this, so we published this in 2021. Soon after that, some of the authors of that started talking about what we might do next, and there was a suggestion that we might get together to develop what became a very large collection, a big edited collection book, to try and develop some of the big ideas of positive public administration. And we start to develop this idea that there's multiple pathways to positive public administration, and also this idea that we would have to try and articulate what this even meant in our field. From the start, we were really committed to having this be a very international book, not international in that it was, America, England and Australia, but a truly international book, which could tell the positive story of what was going on around the world. And we were very, very committed to this being an open access book. If anyone would like to talk about the craziness of academic publishing, this is a great example where you do all the work and then pay 20,000 euro to have it published so that people can read it. It's quite perverse incentives. At the centre of the project were really two big questions. The first one is, why is it that in a universe of like cases around the world, there are specific public policies or programs, organisations, and so on that do better than others? So how do we explain the same things behaving differently in different contexts? And we were particularly interested in identifying positive examples of that, where things would work. And the second thing that animated the project was really, how can we as scholars analyse and understand these exemplars of excellence in order to support broader policy agendas and contribute to a better understanding of politics and government. So there was two parts to really our interest. One was the identification and explanation, and then the second part was, how could we take this work and translate it for our colleagues in practice so that it meant something more than just an academic publishing project. And that group of scholars in the original manifesto, and then the group that sort of broke out to do the book, were fully committed to this. All of them are deeply engaged scholars who work very closely with practice. In the opening sections of the book, and what was interesting about this project is we didn't come with a sort of ready-made framework or intellectual framework for what was positive public administration. And so we were sort of iterating actually as the book emerged. And part of the model that we used for developing the book around a range of workshops with our colleagues was helping us to try and even start to articulate what positive public administration was. In the opening section of the book, we talk about positive public administration in two ways. The first is as an academic mindset. What is it that academics would be interested in terms of this positive turn? And that gave us, I think, some important foundations, or what I would think of as sort of anchors for the work. And the second was a practitioner mindset, which I'll talk about in a moment. In terms of the academic mindset, we set out some of the key ideas as we see it at this stage, with always an eye to the fact that this will develop and change over time, in some ways mimicking what we see in the public value debate and theory as well, which is not fundamentally different, but it's certainly developed in many different ways than when it was first set out. So we were talking about setting out an agenda of research that revealed positivity. We were not saying that people shouldn't focus on what was problematic, or that we should put critical perspectives aside, or we should forget about government failures. But we wanted to open up an equally fertile intellectual space to consider what happens when government gets things right. We wanted to understand what works in government and governance, as well as the failures and fiascos. We had to think about, how do we find these cases of positivity, and how would we think about examining them when we did? We wanted to think about what were some of the factors and mechanisms that really drive positive outcomes. We knew that the idea of what positive was would be very highly contested, just as it is in the public value debate. What is value is a hotly contested idea. And we knew that we would cover instances of good things happening and bad things not happening. So it wasn't just about government producing positive outcomes or successful sort of public administration. It was stopping bad things happening as well. And we knew that there would be some stories that would be in between. From the outset, we wanted to be very inclusive of a diversity of approaches to thinking about this was. We did not come to the project with a set idea of what positive public administration would be. For many scholars, this is a very, very difficult intellectual space to hold because your authors are asking you for guidance and they're asking you to give them a framework to write to or ideas to write to. And so it was quite a challenging space for our authors as well, but they delivered an extraordinary collection. We also knew that we would find many pathways to positivity. That emerged very quickly, as did the critiques of the work. So as soon as the manifesto piece was published in 2021, there was a very quick piece that came out critiquing that work. And that's a good thing in a debate. And for us, it's a good thing as well. But we knew that we had to understand both what works and what doesn't to be able to tackle some of the big challenges that confront us now. It's not enough to just focus anymore on the problems. We need to be looking for cases of success that we can try and replicate in different ways. And we also looked at the idea of PPA, I'll use the acronym now if that's okay, as a practical mindset. Part of this is being driven by a real commitment to inform and even perhaps inspire practice. This would always be more than an academic exercise. And we wanted to employ this idea of positive public administration to be able to identify potential language, institution and rituals that might be associated with a positive mindset. And this is not just for the book, but for the broader movement, I think, of how we think about positive public administration. And we were committed to things like decency and fairness and efficiency and pragmatism as important values that would guide the work as well. We knew from the start that, and all of us, I think, involved in the book would be very conscious of this, that context matters profoundly. And for many of us, this is not a surprise, but it's a very, very important principle to keep reminding when you do work like this, because people often look to the work as sort of a set of ingredients or a recipe that they can follow for success. And even to pull out a few examples from the book, you can see there are many pathways to get there. And what works in Burkina Faso or what works in New Zealand or what works in Pakistan is not necessarily going to work somewhere else. And so we wanted to be very clear that we were not writing the sort of guide to positive public administration for practitioners to follow. And we were really delighted that practitioners have made important contributions to the book as well. And I was especially proud to say that we published someone's first ever publication in that book. To me, that was a wonderful thing. Let me just say a couple of things about the project itself and how we came to doing that. I already mentioned that we didn't come into the book project with a set idea of what positive public administration was. And again, this was really challenging for our authors, but they really rose to that challenge because in part what they were doing in their exploration was defining this undefined idea. And so that was really exciting. We did things differently because we wanted to build a community of people interested. We had certainly of any project I've ever been involved in, a very concerted effort to be very inclusive internationally, to be generationally very inclusive. So we had sort of more senior and more junior people involved. And we worked really hard to identify a whole range of people that were not in our regular network of people that we would normally come across in our own sort of intellectual networks or our conferences and so on. So we actually did a lot of work identifying potential people from around the world. We did not want to have just the same old voices saying the same things. We wanted to have an opportunity to hear from the fullest possible set of experts. We really wanted to explore the idea of what PPA was. We did not define it up front. And we wanted to, as I said, be very inclusive, and we wanted to develop relationships with people certainly around the world. And we wanted people to engage with the critique. It came very quickly, and so some of our colleagues did that. We had 27 contributions in the final book. I think it's about 200,000 words, or 250. I did word count that at some stage. 57 authors in that collection, and every continent with the exception of Antarctica is represented in the collection. And we had several online workshops at different stages so people could test their ideas and we could think about what this actually was. And can I say for the editors, it was a truly joyful project. It's one that I've never worked in that mode before, of all these workshops along the way and really engaging in that way. Often these edited collections are, you write a brief, you tell people to deliver their chapter, you give them some comments, and then it's over. We started with some ideas, but by the end of it, we changed profoundly in how we were going to represent the work. And so what we did was focus in on three big areas: this idea of sort of foundations and practices and tools. And so I'll just give a brief mention of those before I hand over. I won't talk about the foundations, but I can take that in questions. But that was really an attempt to set out the history and politics and this idea of pathways. And then we decided to zoom in and zoom out. This is how we talked about it to make sense of these ideas to ourselves. So we zoomed out to a much broader range of nations and collections of nations than you would tend to see in what I'd call a mainstream public administration book. Often it's considered international if it's got, 5 countries, and they're usually the same 5 countries, or what Usman calls in his book the weird countries, are usually where you see so much of the attention in public administration, and it leaves out the vast majority of the world and all of that administrative tradition which we're poorer for not talking about. So we had contributions from Burkina Faso, Canada, Puerto Rico, Germany, Kenya, Latin America, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Pakistan, Bhutan, and also a subset of Western democracies here, where our authors were providing insights into how various combinations or configurations of practices in a particular country setting or cross-country setting could chart these pathways towards positive public administration. Rather than a set formula, we could see here that there were really multiple ways on this pathway to positivity. And this is where we see the wonderful chapter from Dr. Chohan on COVID-19 in Pakistan. And that was a real highlight, I can tell you, amongst the editors of the book. I say that with no need to flatter such a prominent scholar, but it was one that came in and we all loved it immediately. In the third section of the book, we zoomed in. So we'd gone out to look at a much broader set of contexts and how important that was. And in the third section, we zoomed in to look at tools and mechanisms and aspects of what was sort of helping to explain these ideas of positivity. And here we have people looking at everything from partnerships, cultural competency, participation, co-production, and a whole range of ideas of how various tools can help to produce positivity in practice. Here we started to see the practicalities of positive public administration in more detail and how these pathways get created. So here there was, again, this sort of configurations of some of these different tools, and it starts us really on a much larger journey. There are many other potential tools we could look at, and which I'm sure will come out in the work to come in this field. So that's a brief summary of a massive book, and one that was an absolute delight to work on. And we did work on that for over 2 years. We purposefully did that over a longer period than normal, so that we could start to build a community and a movement around these ideas. And certainly, as I said, one of the most fascinating chapters that came through very early and in very, very good condition was the one on the COVID experience in Pakistan. And I'm really delighted that we were able to include that. And it's been a a real delight to work with Dr. Chohan on that, and finally for us to get to be in the same book together. So I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Janine. Thank you for your presentation, and we are looking forward to reading the book and thoroughly exploring the insights that have been shared within this book. I'd now like to invite Dr. Usman Chohan to share the insights and lessons from positive public administration for Pakistan. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Zara. First of all, Janine, thank you for guiding us through that process. It's valuable for us at two levels. The first is conceptually, so that our audience today can appreciate this. In that too, there's multiple levels, because we have people at CASS who are studying public administration. We have people who have served in government at a very senior level, dedicated their lives to it, and sometimes their feelings about it bittersweet, because what did they give this life for, etc. And then the other aspect of it is that you've really given us an insight into how this process works. I do know personally that doing an edited volume is a big challenge, so this is very informative in that regard. Now, within this project, spearheaded by Janine and 3 other editors, I had a chapter. And so we'll skip to that now. So, lessons for Pakistan. My chapter was about the COVID-19 context and Pakistan. So, as we know, government is often easily a bête noire. It's something that you can complain about anytime, anywhere. There's a lot of criticism that the government is stupid, the government is inadequate, the government engages in theft. There's a lot of negativity and resentment towards the government anywhere, anytime. And this is probably more so true in developing countries. The reason for that is that legitimacy issues in the third world exist. Public compliance, lower public trust, weaker public compliance. This makes it difficult to deliver public value in a co-creative, multi-stakeholder manner. The legitimacy is not as strong. The second thing is the recognition of public value. It's very often the case. You can point out that government is not just part of the problem, government might just be the problem. This sort of attitude is prevalent in developing countries as well as developed, but perhaps more so in developing countries. And the third thing is there simply may not be enough operational resources with governments in the developing world. And that can be any kind of operational resource, including funding, personnel, having the right people in place, the infrastructure, the data, the tools, the management, simply the design of government. It may emerge from a colonial mindset and so on. So there are many hindrances that give warrant to actual legitimate criticism of government. And so when you have that sort of attitude, you have to wonder about whether positive public administration would apply to a context like that. So my argument when Janine gave this vague template, as she said, I'm paraphrasing, without rigid guidelines, then my question was, well, I wonder if this is really universal, because if it only applies to the weird countries, weird meaning white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, if it's just that niche of countries, then this theory won't go very far, because you're just patting yourself on the back. In order for public administration like PPA, positive public administration, to thrive as a concept, it must be applicable everywhere. So I looked at the applicability in 2 ways. One, that it should be in developing country context, such as Pakistan, and then it should be in crisis context as well. So it's all hunky-dory, everything's fine, then you're not really gauging the positivity. But when push comes to shove and they test the mettle of a society, then you see how people react and if they're still positive. So crisis is also a good lens for that. So do we have the full picture of government by just being negative and yelling at bureaucrats and politicians? No, there are positive aspects, and the practitioners here at CASS understand that because they gave their working lives to that. So PPA speaks to that, the study of the positive. In the initial appeal, as well as the manifesto, there was a core theme of learning to learn from what works. Like, so learn how to learn from what works. So I said the what works must be in a crisis context, a developing country. That's how you'll figure it out if it really matters. And the conceptual starting points mention that there is a virtu and a fortuna. So there is the good luck but there's also the hard work. And that's what matters. Did you put in the right effort as a government? And were you just lucky? Those two aspects were. And as Janine mentioned, it's not just about good things that you can do or have done, but also the bad things that you avoided or saved your people from. So bad things not happening is probably equally good, if not better, than good things happening. And the measure of success will be in many ways. You can't just measure this was the single metric of success. Now, in the context of my chapter, yes, there were some ex ante advantages for Pakistan in COVID-19, and I've done extensive work on that in these two books, so I'm not going to repeat that stuff here. But why it was that we had these advantages, and then also why we had these disadvantages coming into the crisis of COVID, they were equally significant. But the outcome was distinctly positive in Pakistan. And I pointed out that you can have an empirical grounding for it. You can look at lives saved or disabilities or deaths or the GDP numbers and so on. There are metrics that you can use to see, yeah, you did well, both in absolute terms, but also comparing to other countries, perhaps of an equal size, an equal level of development, etc. So there are ways to actually measure this stuff. That's where the methodological considerations come, that you have quantitative as well as qualitative approaches. Did COVID come with a big bat and whack us, or did we whack it back? That's the concept. So how did we combat against this challenge, and to what extent did we do it? So these two books cover that in extensive detail, but then situating this in positive public administration was both my challenge and opportunity here. So there are many things that go into that, and all of us here have been through that. At the same time, you will see that COVID feels like it happened just yesterday, but also sometimes you feel that COVID happened a million years ago. It's somewhere deep in the recesses of your memory. This is part of the trauma. So it feels like this happened a while ago, and yet it happened just yesterday. So what was it that was done? First of all, leadership was very important in this. And there were regular appeals made to the nation by the leadership, including technocrats, bureaucrats, people assigned to important positions, that gave the right messaging, that you take care and you cannot give up. We cannot afford to close down. God willing, we will solve this problem. We must, etc. So it's very important to have that messaging. Then there were technical elements, special hospitals, testing laboratories, all of those things were put in. The science, you can't just on a feel-good basis do it. You have to have the right things in place. And important was also learning from abroad. So you see what everyone has done and then apply it in your context appropriately. That was very well done with World Health Organization best practices, the optimal lockdown approach. So we didn't either have sweeping lockdowns, closing things down, nor did we have an open air policy all the time. It was this street in this sector has to be shut, that kind of optimization. So taking a mathematical approach in what you may otherwise stereotype as a primitive social setting. No, it was very mathematically approached. And civil society was very important in that positive effort, because where the administrative state did not have adequate reach, the people stood by the system to get it done. For example, we have this rural support program, which involves millions of women reaching out to very remote areas. They're usually for the polio context. That polio instrument was then used for COVID. So whatever instruments we had, we converted it as necessary for that. And very important was that everybody was on the same page. There was something called the NCOC, which was the nerve center for doing the entire country's work on COVID, with real-time inputs from the field hospitals, etc. Both the civilian, military, everybody was on the same thing in a depoliticized manner, because the enemy was not political in any way. You had to just deal with the science and get things done. And then that's on the public health side, but also the economic side was managed very well. I will point that CASS had direct inputs into this on the economic side, and there was a precision in the stimulus strategy. So the most cyclical portions of the economy got the stimulus. You will see that in other countries, it was just flushing out money and then retracting it later. Just most of it went to corporations anyways, etc. It wasn't like that here, because it was very targeted. And there was something called the TERF fund facility for that. So it was very well done on the economic side. And then this concept from public administration saw its practical application with network governance. So the hospital system is aligned with the NCOC and the rural support, as I mentioned, etc. So when you do all of these, you get an outcome like this. If you look at this graph, this is deaths over time in about 19 months, and from, let's say, sort of, excuse me, a year and a half, and so slightly less. And March to June, so 2020 to 2021, look at where the United States was, which is larger than Pakistan. Pakistan is now 200 million plus, almost 250 million, if not higher. And yet, look at the difference. Same with Brazil, which has a comparable population, and then India, which has, you know, a massive population, but there are common genetic and cultural and other factors that would put us ex ante in a supposition that you would have the same outcome, but no way. The deaths were so low. And same for the economic side, it was done so well. And those metrics are then examined in the chapter. And so our GDP fell by less than 1% in a time of otherwise global economic paralysis. Cases and deaths were extremely low. And my favorite one was the normalcy index. So how quickly did you return to normal? So the top three in the world, according to this normalcy index, were Hong Kong and New Zealand and Pakistan. So small, wealthy islands that don't have natural crossovers. You can't just walk to Hong Kong or New Zealand. And we're put in the same category of success as that, as a massive country which was landlocked on three sides and far larger population. How can we have done the same as them? It's quite amazing. And so that's the result you get from it. So what was the ultimate framing of it? Because of that, there are positive outcomes which we measure, and there's a positive mindset of the messaging, and therefore you get positive public administration. This is what I posited to Janine and the other editors. Now, there are major lessons. I think this is the slide we will use for our future work via CASS, that PPA does have a universality because it did apply to that context. And we need positivity more than ever. I'm very fortunate that President Cass, I know, particularly to be a person of extreme positivity, and I really appreciate this. This positivity changes a lot about organizations, societies, etc. We need to be positive. Pakistan has demonstrated its potential in a crisis context by maintaining positivity. And positivity doesn't mean laughing around and goofing off. It actually is a sober state of mind, but an upbeat one. And all stakeholders in society must be on the same page and have that same mindset of, God willing, we shall overcome. Now, this is where the last word, which is not really mentioned in the chapter, but something for us to reflect on, that there is a tragedy in this too. A tragedy is that you know that Pakistan can do such amazing things, and the proof is now in front of you. That's why we all feel disheartened inside, because we know that things could be better overall. And if you didn't believe that, you wouldn't actually care. You would just simply shrug your shoulders and not have confidence or optimism about the future. You just simply wouldn't care. But we care because we know we can do better as a society and as a member of the global community to contribute more to it. We have that potential. This is a common refrain that Pakistan has so much potential. It is true, and that's what pains us. So we have to approach that tragedy with positivity. So that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Usman. And it has been rightly pointed out that the handling of COVID-19 was one of the finest demonstrations of positive public administration in Pakistan, and one that the students and professionals of public administration can continue to learn lessons from. We now have a 10 minutes question and answer session. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Right, so before we have a question, there are two questions that I have, and any of one of you can answer these. My first question is that what advice would you give to the bachelor's and master's students who are studying public administration about their careers? And my second question is that what advice would you give to the young bureaucrats, people who have just passed the National Civil Service exam in Pakistan, about their career?
For you, Janine.
Sure, I'm very happy to have that, because this, I think, is really, really important, and it goes to some of the opening comments that you made around the negativity bias around government in many settings, and it's a relatively strong story around the world. Of course, every country is different, and within countries things are different, but it's clear that there's a very strong sort of negative view in many parts of the world about government. This worries me a lot because we know that people in the public services of the world have a profound impact on people's lives. I had the opportunity this year to speak with the graduates who were going into the graduate development program in the national government here. They were all brought together in Canberra for one day, and I had a chance to speak with them. And I spoke with them a lot about ideas around positive public administration, but also in another piece of work I've been doing, I've been also talking about humility and empathy. Like how can you come to the world of complexity that we grapple with every day, particularly for those who have careers in the practice of public service. How do you cope with that complexity and be able to have some humility in that? And this is very difficult in a system like Australia, which is very contestable. We have, a two-party system where there's a lot of conflict between parties, and they're both trying to explain why they're different than the other to get political mileage. And so one of the things I spoke with that youngest group of people entering the civil service here was that what they do, even if they don't realize it yet, has a profound impact on the lives of people. The decisions they make and the action they take, and they may not see the direct line of that early at this stage. And I think we start to see it as people's careers develop. But I really think it's important for people to understand that what they're doing in their vocation and their career really does create value for the world and for the communities that they serve, and that for them to enter into that role with that mindset is very powerful. So that for me is really important. On the second question, what advice do I have for students studying PPA? I think it's a really fascinating and very developing idea. We didn't answer all the questions about it in one book. And in the same way that we have both written about this idea of public value, which has been written about for the last 40 years, but we still haven't settled on what necessarily that is. This is the job of scholars to keep creating new ideas for us to deal with. But there's something about this historical moment, I think, which is really important. It goes to issues of trust and legitimacy, and that is a global phenomenon. It does look different in different settings, but these issues are really very important. And so I think about advising students on studying positive public administration as one strategy for thinking about that. I'm going to meet on Thursday with a group of very senior people from across the Australian public service, and I'm going to do a session with them in the morning, which will be around positivity and humility and complexity and empathy, and why these are the emerging ideas in a new paradigm of public administration that will shape our future. And we're not quite there yet, but these are the ideas that are developing. And so I think for students to study that at this time is really important. That's a long answer, sorry.
Thank you for your answer. We have 2 more questions. One of them is from Servine. Please go ahead with your question.
Assalamu alaikum. I am Nasir Vai and director at CASS. I would like to thank both the speakers for a very valuable talk. I would like to take few very concrete lessons home, considering the topic itself, PPA lessons for Pakistan. Like Dr. Chohan has rightly pointed out that we were at best during COVID-19. All the stakeholders which made policies, they convinced the masses that this is the right decision or series of decisions that we are taking. So the public came across along with the stakeholders and we came as a winner. In fact, Dr. Chohan will bear me out that some places our exports were even better during the COVID time as compared to the normal days. My question is that what goes wrong in other aspects when we have to face different challenges? Why can't we follow the same model? Can we draw a couple of concrete lessons that what is the importance of the policies that the stakeholders are making? And why is the public not willing to accept those policies? And that is why these are not being implemented. What 2, 3 concrete steps that the stakeholders should take? Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, you've raised an important point. My lighthearted answer is that perhaps we do need a permanent apolitical enemy like COVID to keep us on the same side. In fact, we get in our own way, as your and my and everyone else's experience here is informed. We know that we get in our own way, and perhaps looking at permanent aspects of what was done in COVID for the better is something we need to incorporate. For example, having everybody on the same page through structures, involving the people, listening to the people, doing targeted measures. What it tells you is that the excuse that we don't have enough resources is not true. It may have been true in West Pakistan in 1950, but it isn't true anymore. Everything that we need to solve things is already there. And simply having everybody on one page through the persuasion, the consent of the governed, etc., is very, very important now. Thank you.
I would say we every time I'm in a presentation or working with senior officials talking about collaboration or how different parts of government work together, I get asked almost exactly that same question. Why can we do things in crisis that we can't do in our normal day-to-day? It's a very frustrating. I know for senior officials to have that. And so part of what I've always spoken about in that environment, and in fact, COVID made me rethink this profoundly, was when we have a crisis, we often have a very clear purpose. So in Australia, we have bushfires, wildfires every year, which are devastating in this country. And whenever we have what we call a bushfire, we often get very coordinated effort around that. There's a clear purpose. Interestingly, there's often a pre-agreed set of ways that we will operate in a crisis because we have predicted a crisis, whether it's flood or famine or fire, for example. These crises are often time-bound. What broke my advice on this one was really that the time just kept going on. So if we're dealing with a bushfire example, there's a very clear stages of that crisis. We have putting the fire out, rebuilding, and so on. And there's really interesting work that I've used a lot in looking at collaboration during crisis versus business as usual, if we'd like to use that term, which looks at the different investments of trust and time and the sharing of territorial turf between different parties in complex systems like government. And it was really illustrative to me in explaining that until we had a global crisis that went for some years. And what we saw in Australia, and the stories are different in every part of the world, was in the initial stages of the COVID crisis, it fit all of my pre-existing sort of ideas about what would happen during crisis. So we saw clear purpose, parties came together, they shared turf, they developed some innovative new infrastructure to deal with this. But over time in Australia, what happened is that fell apart because there was no sense that they could bind those parties. So states and territories started to want different rules for their citizens. COVID was impacting different geographic regions. Australia used some of the hardest lockdowns and also flooded the economy with money. So it raised a whole series of other issues now that we'll deal with in the long run. So I think it's really important, the points around persuasion that were mentioned, the points around purpose for me are incredibly important. How you hold actors to a common purpose over a prolonged period of time is very difficult. I was interviewed very early in the pandemic by a colleague from the United Kingdom who was doing a series called Government versus the Virus, and he was interviewing people from around the world. And Australia was seen as an exemplar case of government success. And I said, I don't know how long it can hold. I don't know how long Australians who are a little bit rebellious will submit to this. And I don't know how long our different parts of government can hold that collaborative sort of moment. And of course, that fell apart over time. But it made me think profoundly differently about it. And so reading a chapter like Dr. Chohan did about Pakistan, which broke in some ways all these expectations and rules. And that's one of the things I really enjoyed about that that chapter, was that it was against expectations, right? And that was what makes it such a wonderful example. And it proves our point, I think, which is to say that to understand public administration, we must see what's going on all around the world, not just in this very narrow set of countries, but we need to be looking everywhere for what are the various sort of models of positivity. So again, long answer, but very good questions.
We have the last question from Shah Mohammed. Shah Mohammed, please.
Thank you, Zara. And thank you so much, Ms. Jenny and Dr. Usman Chohan, for this wonderful talk. In recent years, we have seen the emergence of non-governmental actors in terms of public services, like civil society actors, even private actors who are offering wonderful services to people. My question is, don't these organizations indirectly affect or undermine the credibility of the government, because they are the first who are offering the services and government is on the second front, as we have seen in COVID. So what is their role, their influence in the public administration, and don't they undermine the credibility and even the legitimacy of the government organizations? Thank you.
I could speak about this one for about 5 hours without even taking a breath. It's a really, really, it's a fundamental question about how we think about network governance, some of the things that were so well done in Dr. Chohan's chapter, how that was activated. We saw that across a range of the chapters, this idea of network governance really coming to life. I've spent probably the best part of 20-something years studying how government engages with what I call external parties to get the work of government done. And my views on that are very pragmatic. There's many things that government itself cannot do, or that you don't want to develop the capacity to do for many reasons, cost and expertise and change and so on. In the world of public value, where we've both written and looked at, there's no sense that it has to be government that produces public value. And what I really like about that idea, and it's very grounded in practice, is that there's a range of actors that contribute to that creation of value, and some of them are private, and some of them are non-profit, and some of them are communities through co-production, who are all contributing to the creation of public value. In Australia, we've had this really interesting political discourse in recent years, which is around government's capacity declining and deteriorating over time, because so much of what it has done has been given to parties outside. And the most pronounced example of that, and part of a big debate in Australia at this stage, is how much of the work of what we would think of as sort of senior policy advisors has been outsourced to consulting companies, not to think tanks or governments or universities and so on, but to the big consulting houses. And the current government in Australia has now set a range of targets for bringing that expertise back in to government, and for reduced spend on consultants to try and fill this capacity gap that goes to questions that you raise around legitimacy and capacity. I'm a big fan of the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who's at University College London. She's just released a book on on consultants, but over her writings of the last decade, she's also looked at this question of how we might have created a self-fulfilling prophecy by sending so much of what government has done in the past to other actors, private and non-profit, and then wonder why we can't do anything anymore. COVID showed, in my view, both the positives and negatives of those relationships. The example in Pakistan of the ability to tap into those networks of non-profit organizations and so on to actually fulfill the public value and to protect the citizenry was extremely powerful. In other countries, we saw the fact that government had lost its capacity to know how to do things was really very profoundly negative. So it's a very, very difficult question. It's one I've spent 2 decades looking at without having a simple answer. My answer is always, it depends. That's not an easy answer, but it's such a policy by policy, case by case question about legitimacy and capacity of government and how you need to develop very particular sort of I call it relational architecture to be able to do that work in a way that doesn't hollow out government and means that you still have the capacity to act when you need. It's a really very profound question and a very difficult one to give an easy answer to. But a great question, a question I keep thinking about probably for the next 20 years as well.
I would now request President CASS Air Marshal Javed Ahmed to deliver the vote of thanks. Please, sir.
Janine, thank you very much. I think it's a privilege to listen and to understand the work which you've undertaken in this very important domain. And I'm very glad that this issue of public administration and the positivity which it can bring into has been taken up professionally. And I understand that if you had 57 authors, then it must be very comprehensive, a very comprehensive study in which all the global perspectives have been taken into account. But before I conclude and give my concluding remarks, may I ask you that, do you think the work is comprehensive enough to serve as a guideline for governments, or do you think these studies need to be continued further?
I think this is a start on what will be a long journey, and I take some inspiration from the work on public value, which is developing and continuing to develop and iterate as the world changes. And I think if this group of people who have come together to write this will be considered, I hope, one of the sort of foundation documents that sets us on that path. I do believe that people like your colleague, Dr. Chohan, who does such excellent translation work, will be taking ideas from that to be able to be used to be advising government. We're already seeing that. My friend Paul Ter Hart, who works in one of the big think tanks in the Netherlands, is already doing that. I'm doing it here with civil servants on Thursday. So I believe there's enough there for the start of that, and we will continue to build on those ideas for years to come.
And may I ask Dr. Chohan that I understand the work undertaken on COVID is very interesting, and it was an example, I think, which we all need to understand. Pakistan anyway comes together during contingencies, and that is one example. You know, the country came together in COVID as well as the earthquake in 2005. But Dr. Saab, can I ask you that, there are two phases to Pakistan's administrative caliber or abilities, one during contingencies and the other for which we have a lot of questions and a lot of room for improvement. So do you intend to take that up as a study of Pakistan's model of public administration?
Yeah, thank you for this question, sir. Absolutely. The difference between how we deal with contingencies and with the peacetime condition normality is very, very drastic, and there is a lot for us to do. Alhamdulillah, I have worked a lot with you and otherwise on understanding what are our real problems in Pakistan. And the accusation that government is part of the problem is true to some degree, but it isn't the full picture. And teasing out those nuances becomes part of my task to see where government can make those right contributions and where it needs to back off, where other stakeholders of society need to be more prominent. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Usman. While I once again, Janine, I take this opportunity to thank you. And I think listening to you and to the wise words which you have said on this subject, this would not be the last webinar in which we can catch you in an evening in Australia. And we look forward to working with you. I will leave the two of you with some parting thoughts. And the first is, I think the face of public administration is changing rapidly. And that is because of the advent of technology. So I think the next decade or so will find most of your issues and the aspects of public administration being handled by technology. Even now, we have a lot of involvement of AI, and you find a lot of administrative functions already available on your mobile phones. So this level of, I think, and the way the public administration is looked at will drastically change. And I think this should give you some food for thought for your future studies if you take up this issue. But thank you very much for spending this time with us and educating us on a very important subject. Thank you very much. And over to you, Zara.
With this, we come to the end of today's webinar, and I thank you all for being a part of it, particularly Professor Janine. Having you with us was a privilege, and thank you for dedicating your time to be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really an honor for me to come and to share the screen with my wonderful colleague was fantastic. And I look forward to the opportunity to speak again at some stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care, and thank you for your time.